Dungeon Reaper. A light novel by Bloodmoss. Chapter 21. Into the Madness. The shriek of engines cut through the heavy air as a fleet of VTOL, one's massive frame dark and imposing, shadowed the others. It descended like a metal leviathan. Its rotors stirred the dust and ash, sending loose debris skittering across the fractured ground. Smaller tolls followed, weaving between jagged ruins before touching down in practiced unison. Cain shielded his eyes against the wind, boots braced as the air vibrated with the hum of machinery. The heavy doors of one of the smaller crafts hissed open. Terra Windstorm was the first to emerge, her presence as sharp and commanding as the storm her name promised. Her long coat billowed behind her, and with every step, the ground seemed to crack under the weight of her authority. Beside her, Clover Argentis followed, her movements more fluid, almost cat-like, her black hair catching flashes of the distorted gate's light. Cain had heard stories about Maria, how she hadn't changed her form in the slightest after her rebirth into death services. But seeing her now, in the raw light of the real world, was something else entirely. She wasn't exaggerated like Terra, no overwhelming force of nature, but a stunning, effortless beauty. The kind that felt real. Natural. Cain's breath hitched for a second. Close your mouth and wipe the drool off your chin, Grim. Terra's voice snapped him out of it, razor-sharp and laced with amusement. We've got work to do. Cain blinked, scowling. I wasn't. But Clover caught his eye, a playful smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. She winked, slow and deliberate. Cain coughed and looked away, feeling heat creep up his neck. Before he could think of something clever to say, the deep mechanical groan of the largest VTOL stole everyone's attention. Its size dwarfed the others, its hull scarred and reinforced. The side doors clanged open, and a squad of heavily armed DRB soldiers poured out in perfect formation. Behind them, a cluster of scientists hurried to set up strange scanning devices, their voices already rising in alarmed chatter. Then he stepped out. A towering figure with a thick, squared build. His military uniform was immaculate despite the dust, adorned with gleaming insignia. His gray buzz cut looked like it had been carved from stone, and a thick cigar burned slowly between his teeth, the ember glowing bright in the darkening air. Cain straightened instinctively. Even without knowing his name, the authority radiating from the man was suffocating. Shen stepped forward and offered a sharp salute. General Conrad Voss. Voss eyed him with a grunt, puffing on the cigar. Good to see one of Drob's best hunters on this mess of a mission. His voice was gravel, ground down by years of command. Shen gave a curt nod. We'll handle it. One of the scientists jogged up, tablet in hand, sweat beading on his brow. Sir, the gate's readings are unstable. It's spiking beyond Class D, rapidly pushing into Class B parameters. If the energy breach continues, it could collapse, or worse, rupture. We'd see widespread contamination in nearby zones. Voss didn't flinch. Shen turned slightly, eyes narrowing. If we don't stabilize or clear the dungeon, that gate won't just collapse. It'll tear. And what comes through won't be easy to put down. Voss took a slow drag on his cigar, exhaled smoke through his nose. Then I suggest you move quickly, Hunter. Because if this gate rips open and swallows a city, I'll be scraping what's left of you off the ground. Cain stiffened at the cold dismissal, but Shen simply nodded. Understood, sir. Voss grunted and turned back toward the swarm of soldiers and scientists, already barking new orders. Cain leaned closer to Shen, lowering his voice. You sure we're ready for this? Shen didn't look at him. We don't have a choice. Cain let out a slow breath, eyes narrowing on the pulsing, warped gate ahead. The air vibrated with a low hum, the glow shifting from sickly yellow to deep crimson. The ground cracked beneath their feet. And somewhere beyond that veil of twisting energy, something waited. Something broken. Something hungry. The air around the gate rippled with suffocating pressure, a low hum vibrating in the ground beneath them. The energy bleeding from the portal felt unnatural, as if it were peeling reality apart, thread by fragile thread. Every breath carried a weight that pressed into their bones, and even the sky above seemed to recoil from the gate's twisted light. Cain adjusted the strap of the sword Clover had forged for him, the weapon resting heavily across his back. But it wasn't the sword in his hands. His fingers tightened around the familiar grip of his kusarigama, the curved blade gleaming dully in the gate's sickly light. The chain coiled loosely between his fingers, cold and ready. Yet, despite the comfort of the weapon he knew best, the weight pressing on him wasn't from steel, it was the crushing burden of the choices that had led them here. A flicker of movement caught his eye as Clover Argentis shifted her stance, brushing a strand of long black hair behind her ear. Her tone was light, but Cain didn't miss the tension simmering beneath it. "So," she began carefully, her eyes never leaving the distorted gate ahead, "what exactly are we walking into?" Shen Fang barely glanced up from the holographic data flickering at his wrist. His fingers moved steadily, as if reciting from memory. "Takuma Hoshizawa," Shen said, his voice clipped and factual. "Born in Okinawa, Japan. Raised by his father. No records on his mother." Cain stiffened. The words struck something deep within him, and before he could stop it, a memory slid through the cracks in his mind. The sterile glare of fluorescent lights. The sharp scent of antiseptic cutting through the air. A woman, her face blurred by time, gasping, clawing at her throat, her nails tearing into her own skin. The scream that never fully formed, cut short by an invisible hand. Cain blinked hard, forcing the image away, but the bitter taste of it lingered. His voice was rough when he spoke. It wasn't just an accident. He didn't look at anyone as he spoke, eyes locked on the pulsing gate. His mother died during the first wave of awakenings. His abilities, they triggered during her awakening. He couldn't control them. It tore her apart. Shen's head turned sharply toward him, a rare flash of surprise breaking his otherwise composed expression. "Did he tell you that?" Shen's question carried an edge, not of accusation, but of something close to suspicion. Cain slowly shook his head, the corner of his mouth pulling into a grim line. His stare didn't waver from the shifting colors of the gate. "No. I got more than just karate lessons from my black belt buddy." For a moment, Shen studied Cain, weighing something behind his calculating gaze. Whatever conclusion he came to, he didn't share it. "Yeah, well," Shen muttered as he turned back to his display, his tone quieter, but no less sharp. He got a lot more than he bargained for too. The soft hum of Shen's hollow interface filled the tense silence as he scrolled deeper into Hoshizawa's file. Takuma Hoshizawa enlisted in Japan's Special Forces before the first gate events. Adapted quickly. Efficient. Cold. When the gates appeared, he climbed to advanced hunter status in record time, authorized for solo gate runs. No backup, no support. Just him and whatever nightmare was waiting on the other side. Cain's brow furrowed, pulling himself from his thoughts. "Hunter status?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with curiosity. Shen didn't look up, his tone as flat as the data he was reading. "Solo clearance for active gate assignments. When teams aren't available or the threat is too unstable, they send in a hunter to finish it quietly." Cain's lips pressed into a thin line as he processed that. "So, you're a hunter too?" The question hung there for only a moment before Maria scoffed from where she leaned against a supply crate, casually checking the chamber of her sidearm. "A hunter?" Maria snorted, rolling her eyes. "Shen Liang isn't just a hunter. He's the hunter." She smirked, tapping the barrel of her gun against her shoulder. "One of the few DRB keeps on a tight leash. When things get bad enough, they don't send a team, they send him." Cain blinked, studying Shen with fresh scrutiny. "Huh, that explains the smug prick attitude." A thin smirk tugged at Shen's mouth, but he didn't bother replying. After the S-Class gate disaster in Wichita, Hoshizawa was instrumental in the recovery effort, Shen continued, his voice hardening as he scrolled through the grim reports. 2 years ago, he retired quietly. Opened a dojo near Crystal Gate. Went dark. No incidents, no red flags. Until now. The pause that followed was deliberate. Shen's tone shifted, becoming colder. His recorded abilities included mental projection, precognition, and the standard physical enhancements expected from a rank B hunter. But after what we've seen, it's safe to assume he's moved far beyond that. His abilities are evolving, unrecorded, unpredictable. Shen's gaze lifted, eyes narrowing slightly as they locked onto Cain. Anything else we should know? Cain didn't answer right away. His mind spun with fragments of memories, thoughts that weren't entirely his own. He could still feel the weight of Hoshizawa's presence in his mind, lingering like smoke after a fire. There was more, but nothing he could explain. Nothing that would help. After a long, tense pause, Cain exhaled slowly, his voice quiet but steady. Nothing that matters right now. Shen watched him for a moment longer, then gave a subtle nod and turned back to his display. Tara let out a slow breath and pushed off the crate, breaking the suffocating stillness. Then let's stop standing around and finish this. Shen's eyes narrowed toward the gate. Move out. Cain swallowed hard, his focus locking on the pulsing, fractured gate ahead. Whatever waited for them beyond that veil wasn't Hoshizawa anymore. And it was his responsibility to end it. Crossing the threshold of the corrupted gate was like falling into a suffocating dream. The air thickened immediately, pressing against their lungs with a damp, suffocating weight. The light that had flickered wildly outside the gate gave way to a dull, suffocating gloom. Cain blinked, adjusting to the dark, but what he saw turned his stomach. They stood in the remains of a dojo, or what was left of it. Tatami mats stretched unevenly across the floor, rotting and warped. Thick, black ichor seeped through the cracks, pulling into sluggish rivers that pulsed as if alive. Wooden beams overhead sagged under invisible weight, groaning with each unnatural breath the walls seemed to take. Weapons once used for training hung from the walls, twisted and rusted, their edges fused into the wood like broken limbs. The paper walls, once pristine, now sagged and tore in slow, deliberate movements, revealing not other rooms, but a void empty and endless. Cain instinctively tightened his grip on his kusarigama, the curved blade cold and familiar in his hand. The chain dangled between his fingers, swaying gently, as if anticipating what was to come. Across his back, the sword Clover had forged for him pressed into his spine, a reminder of the strength he had yet to understand. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes settled on the figure at the center of the ruined dojo. Hoshizawa knelt in the center of the room. Or rather, some twisted reflection of him. His shoulders slumped forward, his head hung low, and a broken katana trembled in his grip. Shadows clung to him like a second skin, twisting and flickering, threatening to swallow him whole. Around him, shapes drifted through the gloom, half-formed, barely human. They moved with broken, jerking motions, circling their fallen master. Their faces were featureless smears of flesh and shadow, their limbs unnaturally long and thin. They whispered as they moved, voices barely audible over the suffocating stillness. You taught us strength, but you couldn't save us. Death will take us all. You must save us. The words crawled into Cain's ears like worms, cold and slick. His muscles tensed as his eyes focused on one of the shadows drifting at the edge of the circle. It moved differently from the rest, staggering clumsily, clutching a chipped wooden staff instead of a weapon. Its head tilted, revealing a blurred, half-formed face. It was him. Or something pretending to be him. This version of Cain was pitiful, his posture slouched, his grip on the weapon weak. The figure stumbled forward, nearly tripping over its own feet before attempting a laughably poor combat stance. Cain's grip on his kusarigama tightened, the chain creaking under the strain. Is that? Cain's voice was low, disbelieving. Is that how he saw me? The imitation of himself swung wildly, the attack so clumsy it almost made Cain step back in disbelief. He stared for a long moment, caught between offense and bitter amusement. Seriously? He muttered under his breath, narrowing his eyes. The flicker of humor was brief, crushed by the oppressive weight of the room. Focus. Shen's voice snapped through the gloom, hard and commanding. Cain's attention snapped back to the circling shadows. Tara's grip on her weapon had tightened, but she wasn't moving. Clover hovered nearby, her hands raised, but neither of them struck. Even Maria, usually cocky and unbothered, was unnervingly still. They look like people. Clover's voice was quiet, uncertain. They're not, Shen barked, stepping forward without hesitation. His blade sliced cleanly through one of the student shadows. The figure convulsed and collapsed into a cloud of dark ash. These are pieces of Hoshizawa's mind. Fractured memories made real by this dungeon. They are not people. They are not victims. They are weapons. Shen's cold glare swept over the team, lingering on Tara and Clover. His voice cut through the thick, suffocating air like a blade. Do not hesitate, or they will kill you. For a heartbeat, the room was still. Then Tara moved. Her twin silver blades flashed in a blur of motion, slicing cleanly through two shadow students in a single, fluid arc. The twisted figures barely had time to react before their forms split apart, dissolving into dark mist that drifted away like smoke. Beside her, Clover was already moving with deadly grace. Twin silver pistols gleamed in her hands, each shot ringing out with perfect precision. Bullets tore through the distorted figures with surgical accuracy, black ichor bursting in small, controlled eruptions. Every round found its mark, foreheads, throats, chests, each pull of the trigger deliberate and final. Cain barely had time to process the sudden, efficient violence before instinct kicked in. He forced himself forward, muscles coiling as his kuzarigama slashed outward, the curved blade hooking into the neck of a malformed student. The sickening crunch of bone echoed for a moment before the figure crumbled into black mist. But Cain's eyes snapped to Clover, still coolly lining up her next shot. I thought guns didn't work in dungeons, he muttered, half in disbelief. Without missing a beat, Clover smirked, her eyes never leaving her target. Yeah, she said smoothly, squeezing the trigger. But I'm special. Another shadow fell, its form unraveling as her bullet struck true. Cain exhaled slowly, gripping his weapon tighter. Remind me not to piss you off. The air trembled around them, but the team was in motion now, moving as one. And the dungeon, sensing their resolve, began to twist again. But more closed in, crawling from the dark corners of the room. The ground beneath them cracked, jagged edges splitting the floor apart. Black ichor oozed up between the gaps, thick and slow, threatening to swallow anything that stood still. Cain leapt across a widening crack, narrowly avoiding a surge of the sludge. At the center of the chaos, the figure of Hoshizawa remained still, unmoving, clutching the broken katana as though it were the only thing anchoring him to this world. Shadows clung to him, thick and suffocating, distorting his form like a flickering mirage. Shen Fang moved forward with unsettling calm. He didn't run. He didn't even hurry. His footsteps were deliberate, each one echoing in the suffocating silence that seemed to fall over the corrupted dojo. The distorted students circled them, but none dared approach him. The air around Shen seemed heavier, denser, bending and pulling unnaturally as if reality itself recoiled from him. Cain's eyes tracked Shen's advance, narrowing in confusion. He's unarmed. Cain suddenly realized it. Shen carried no weapon, no blade, no gun. Yet, he moved forward with the certainty of a man who didn't need one. Shen didn't even look at the spectral figure of Hoshizawa. His eyes were half-lidded, almost bored, as if this wasn't worth his full attention. Without breaking stride, Shen raised his right hand, fingers spread lazily, palm open as if gesturing toward nothing at all. Then, with a casual, almost lazy motion, he sliced his hand diagonally through the air. From shoulder to hip. At first, nothing happened. Then the air groaned. Space itself seemed to shear apart along the path of Shen's hand. The very fabric of the dojo twisted unnaturally, warping around the invisible cut. Cain's breath caught as he watched the kneeling figure of Hoshizawa begin to split. A thin, glowing line traced diagonally across Hoshizawa's body, from the base of his shoulder down through his torso, before slowly, impossibly, his form began to slide apart. The movement was eerily smooth, as if the world itself had been instructed to come undone. No spray of blood. No dramatic scream. The figure simply came apart, the two halves peeling away in perfect silence. Then, like shattered glass, Hoshizawa's form disintegrated into fragments of shadow and light, scattering into the dark. The dojo groaned in response, its walls bending inward, as if the room itself were grieving. Cain stared, silent and unmoving, his grip slackening slightly on his weapon. What the hell was that? Shen lowered his hand as if brushing dust from his palm. He turned slightly, casting a glance back at the others. Move, he said simply, as if what he had done required no explanation. Cain swallowed, his pulse still pounding in his ears. He didn't even touch him. And yet, it was over. Shen didn't wait for them to catch up. He continued forward, his footsteps steady as the dojo crumbled around them. But the other shadows didn't falter. Cain turned just in time to see his own clumsy doppelganger stumbling toward him again, weapon raised in a pathetic imitation of an attack. Cain's expression darkened. He swung the chain of his kuzarigama, wrapping it around the figure's neck in one smooth motion. He yanked hard, sending the figure sprawling to the ground. Okay, Cain muttered, adjusting his grip as the shadowy form dissolved into mist. That's enough of that. Yet, despite how easily he dispatched it, a thought gnawed at the back of his mind. That wasn't just how Hoshizawa saw me. Maybe it's how they all do. A cold weight settled in his chest, but there was no time to dwell on it. Keep moving. Shen's voice cracked through the air like a whip. Cain gritted his teeth, forcing the thought away as he moved forward. This dungeon wasn't nearly done with them yet.